He had just lost the biggest match of his career. And the first person to reach him wasn't a teammate. It was the 19-year-old who had just beaten him. On a Sunday night at the New Jersey Stadium in East Rutherford, Lionel Messi stood alone on the pitch, the World Cup final over, Spain celebrating a few yards away. Then Lamine Yamal broke off from his own celebration and walked straight toward him. Cameras caught the embrace. 4 days, nobody outside that moment knew exactly what was said. Now Yamal has explained it himself, and it's turned one photograph into one of the defining images of the entire tournament. Let's start with what actually happened, because this is the part that spread everywhere within minutes. Spain had just beaten Argentina 1-0 in extra time, a Ferran Torres strike in the 106th minute finally breaking a deadlock that had held for the better part of 2 hours. For Argentina, it ended any hope of becoming back-to-back champions. For Messi, at 39 years old and almost certainly playing in his final World Cup, it meant the tournament was ending in defeat rather than the fairy tale so many had hoped for. He stayed on the grass for a moment, visibly gutted, while the celebration built around him. And that's when Yamal, who had just become a world champion at 19, walked away from his own teammates to find him. The two shook hands, then pulled into a hug that lasted several seconds. Photographers captured the exchange from multiple angles, and one image in particular, the two of them standing close, mid-conversation, was picked up and shared by broadcasters and fans across the world within the hour. For a while, nobody had audio. The internet did what it always does with silence like that. It filled in the blanks with guesses. Then Yamal actually said what happened. He explained that he went over simply to show respect, calling Messi the best player in history and someone he has admired his whole life. He described the moment as the culmination of something he never seriously pictured for himself this early in his career, standing across from his idol on the sport's biggest stage, let alone beating him there. And then he revealed what Messi told him back. According to Yamal, Messi encouraged him to keep going his own way, and told him the future of the sport now belongs to his generation. Yamal said those words meant as much to him as the gold medal hanging around his neck. Sit with that for a second. A teenager who had just won the World Cup, standing in the most triumphant moment of his career so far, says a losing opponent's words meant just as much to him as the trophy itself. That's not a throwaway line. That's not something you say for a headline. That's a 19-year-old telling the world that a few sentences from a man twice his age landed harder than a medal he'll keep for the rest of his life. It's worth remembering, too, that this wasn't a one-way street of admiration built only in that moment. Before the final was even played, Messi had already spoken warmly about Yamal, calling him a tremendous player with a global following and pointing out that at 19, his whole career is still ahead of him. So when Messi found the words to say after the loss, it wasn't a stranger offering condolences. It was one Barcelona great effectively handing something to the next one. But this quiet, respectful scene was happening only a few feet away from something far uglier, something that had nothing to do with respect at all. To understand why that final whistle felt so heavy, it helps to rewind to about an hour earlier, before either team had even stepped onto the field. A video filmed in the Argentina dressing room, shortly before kickoff, started circulating widely the day after the match, and it immediately caught people's attention. In it, Messi is seen addressing his teammates in the tunnel, urging them repeatedly to stay calm, to think only about the football, about passing and rotating and not giving the ball away, and, strikingly, to forget about everything else. He said it more than once. Forget about everything. Focus on playing. To a lot of viewers, that phrasing felt odd, almost cryptic, for a team about to walk out into a World Cup final. Social media did what it does, and within hours there were theories flying around about hidden drama in the camp, unspoken tension, something being covered up. Some fans pointed out that Enzo Fernandez appeared to be in tears in the tunnel before kickoff, which only added fuel to the speculation, especially given his surprising red card later in the match. The explanation that eventually emerged was far simpler, and far more human, than any of the conspiracy theories. According to people close to the squad, Messi's message wasn't about anything scandalous at all. Alexis McAllister's father, speaking to Argentine radio, said he'd reached out to his son directly because he too was unsettled by the tone of the clip, and that his son told him the talk had genuinely just been about tactics, about shape and patience against a team that presses as relentlessly as Spain does. Separately, a journalist who covers the national team closely reported that part of what made the moment so emotional in the room was that Messi had told his teammates this was likely going to be his last game for Argentina. That context reframes the entire tunnel video. It wasn't a captain hiding something. It was a 39-year-old, about to play what he suspected might be his final match in the shirt that defined his career, trying to keep a room full of players calm and focused instead of letting the weight of the occasion swallow them whole. It didn't entirely work, at least not offensively. Argentina played a cautious, careful final, and for the first 90 minutes, Scaloni's side didn't register a single shot on target, reportedly the first time that has happened for any team in World Cup final history through regulation play. It took a red card and extra time for the match to really open up, and even then, it was Spain who finally broke through. So this wasn't just a story about what Messi said after the whistle. It was bookended by two very different kinds of leadership on the same night. A captain trying to hold his team together with calm, practical words before kickoff, and then, in defeat, finding something entirely different to say to the young opponent who had just beaten him. Here's the part that most of the warm, feel-good clips leave out entirely. Almost the instant the final whistle blew, while Yamal was making his way toward Messi, a completely different scene was unfolding elsewhere on the same pitch. Argentina defender Noel Molina appeared to strike Spain captain Rodri in the chest as he ran past to join his celebrating teammates. Words were exchanged. Spain's Eric Garcia moved in to get between them, and that's when things escalated. Argentina's Leandro Paredes went after Garcia, appearing to grab him by the throat. From there it spread fast. Argentina head coach Lionel Scaloni rushed in trying to physically separate players. Paredes then turned toward Spain's teenage midfielder Gavi and threw him down to the turf by his bib. Several players had to step in just to break it up. Video that circulated afterward also appeared to show Argentina assistant coach Roberto Ayala striking Spain's Dani Olmo, something Ayala later described as more of a push than a punch, while still saying he intended to apologize. None of this was Argentina's only disciplinary trouble of the night. Midfielder Enzo Fernandez had already been sent off in second-half stoppage time for a rough challenge on Spain's Pau Cubarsí, meaning Argentina played the closing stages of the biggest match of their careers a man down before the full-time brawl even started. What made the contrast even sharper is that, according to footage that went viral in the days after, Yamal was seen kneeling and raising his hands in what looked like a quiet moment of thanks while the chaos broke out just behind him. Same pitch. Same 60 seconds. Two completely different pictures of what football can look like in its rawest moment. FIFA didn't let it slide. Football's governing body confirmed it opened a formal investigation into the post-match incidents, appointing a disciplinary and ethics prosecutor to review potential breaches of its code of conduct involving players from both benches. Paredes, notably, was not shown a red card in the moment, despite already having picked up a yellow card earlier in the second half for a rough tackle. That has only added to the scrutiny, since broadcasters initially reported he had been sent off, before FIFA clarified no card was actually issued on the pitch. Interestingly, it's Gavi himself, the player who was thrown to the ground, who has pushed back against calls for Paredes to be suspended. Speaking to Spanish radio afterward, he said he didn't think his opponent should be banned, acknowledging that while the images weren't a good look, that physical, aggressive edge is also just part of the game. Paredes, for his part, has returned to pre-season training with Boca Juniors in Argentina and has not issued a public apology for his role in the incident, even as the FIFA investigation continues without a timeline for its findings. So within roughly a minute of the same final whistle, you had one of the most talked-about acts of sportsmanship in recent World Cup memory, and one of the ugliest post-match brawls in years, playing out almost side by side. It says a lot about exactly how much was riding on this one match, for both sides, in completely different ways. The reaction from the players actually caught up in it has been more measured than a lot of the online commentary that followed. Gavi, despite being the one thrown to the ground, made a point of publicly downplaying the incident, telling Spanish radio that he understood the physical, competitive side of the sport and didn't think suspensions were the right outcome. Ayala, for his part, described his own involvement as closer to a push than a strike and said he intended to apologize directly to Olmo. Neither of those responses is the kind you'd expect if the players themselves saw this as some deep, lasting grudge. It reads more like exactly what it looked like in the moment: raw emotion, the pressure of an entire tournament boiling over in the space of a few seconds, on both sides, before cooler heads pulled everyone apart. That doesn't mean it will simply be forgotten. FIFA's process moves independently of how the players involved feel about it, and the appointed disciplinary and ethics prosecutor will make findings on their own timeline, with retroactive sanctions still a real possibility even though no cards were shown on the pitch itself. Paredes, specifically, remains the central figure in that part of the story, and how FIFA ultimately rules on his conduct is likely to shape a good chunk of the conversation around this final for months to come, entirely separate from anything involving Messi or Yamal. What's notable is how cleanly these two threads of the same match have split in the public conversation. Search for the brawl and you'll find outrage, replay breakdowns, and debate over what punishment fits. Search for the hug and you'll find almost universal warmth, admiration, and a photo being treated as one of the defining images of the tournament. Both threads are true. Both happened in the same stadium, within the same minute, involving players who had just spent 2 hours locked in the most physically and emotionally demanding match of their careers. Buried under all of that drama is something that deserves its own attention. Messi didn't just lose this final. He closed out an extraordinary personal tournament while doing it. At 39 years old, Messi played all the way through Argentina's run to the final, finishing as the tournament's second highest scorer with 8 goals and 4 assists across the competition, numbers that would define most players' entire careers, let alone a single summer. He did it all while trying to become the first man to lead his country to back-to-back World Cup titles since Brazil managed it in the 1950s and 60s, a feat no nation has pulled off in over 60 years. Spain, though, simply had the better team on the day. They controlled the match for long stretches, forced repeated saves out of Argentina's goalkeeper Emiliano Martinez, who himself produced a string of outstanding stops to keep the game scoreless deep into extra time, and eventually found their breakthrough through Ferran Torres in the 106th minute. It was, by most statistical measures, one of the more one-sided finals in recent tournament history, even with the scoreline staying close until the very end. And on the winning side, standing right alongside Yamal, was his Barcelona academy teammate Pau Cubarsí, another teenager making history of his own. Together, the two 19-year-olds became part of a very short list of teenagers to ever start a World Cup final. Yamal in particular became the first player his age to hold both a European Championship and a World Cup at the same time, having already won the Continental title 2 summers earlier as a 17-year-old. He wasn't even the standout performer of the tournament by the numbers, finishing with just 1 goal and no assists in the final tally, with Cubarsí picking up individual recognition for his own performances across the competition instead. But Yamal has been consistent about what actually matters to him. Earlier in the tournament, after Spain's win over Belgium, he told reporters plainly that nobody would remember whether he personally scored, only whether the team lifted the trophy. That mindset showed up again in the biggest moment of his career, when he chose to spend the final whistle not celebrating his own achievement, but consoling the man he grew up idolizing. It's worth stepping back and remembering just how quickly Yamal got here. He made his debut for Barcelona's first team as a 15-year-old, became a regular starter as a 16-year-old, and broke into the Spanish national team not long after that. By the time he lifted the European Championship trophy as a 17-year-old, he was already being talked about as the heir to the generation of Spanish playmakers that came before him. 2 years later, he's a World Cup champion, and the 2 trophies sitting on his shelf now put him in territory no teenager in the history of the sport has ever reached before him. Coach Luis de la Fuente deserves his own mention in all of this. At 65, he became one of the older head coaches to win the tournament, guiding a Spain side that had gone years without a competitive loss into the final and then getting it done against the 2-time defending, back-to-back chasing champions. His team's patience, particularly in extra time when Argentina were down to 10 men, was ultimately what? Here's the detail that turned this story from a nice moment into something people couldn't stop sharing. Messi and Yamal's connection didn't start this year. It started almost 20 years earlier, in a picture almost nobody remembered existed. Back in 2007, Barcelona's charity foundation put together a calendar shoot for UNICEF, pairing first-team players with children for a series of photos. One of those images showed a 20-year-old Messi with a baby who was only about 5 months old at the time. That baby was Lamine Yamal. At the time, it was just one photo among dozens, a nice gesture for a good cause, the kind of thing that gets forgotten within a year by almost everyone involved. Yamal grew up not far from Barcelona and eventually joined the club's famous youth academy, La Masia, the same pipeline that had shaped Messi decades before him. That academy has since produced an entire generation of players who featured at this World Cup, including several of Yamal's Barcelona teammates. Nearly 2 decades later, that same baby grew into one of the most talked-about teenagers in world football, wearing the same number 10 shirt Messi once wore at Barcelona, and eventually walking out onto a World Cup final pitch across from him. The old photo resurfaced in the days around the final and spread everywhere, shared by fans and journalists as a genuinely strange piece of football symmetry, a picture nobody could have staged if they tried. Messi has not announced his retirement from international football. He hasn't confirmed this was his last World Cup. But he hasn't denied it either, and in the days since the final, that silence has become its own story. He's 39 now. The next World Cup is 4 years away, which would put him at 43 if he somehow tried to chase a 7th appearance, a stretch that essentially nobody close to the situation is treating as realistic. What's actually happened since the final has been a mix of speculation and reporting rather than any official word from Messi himself. Argentine journalist Gaston Edel, who covers the national team closely for TIC Sports, reported that the final in New Jersey would not be Messi's last appearance for Argentina at the international level, suggesting he's expected to continue at least into upcoming competition. Other reporting out of Argentina has suggested the federation would like to see him continue for a little while longer, potentially through another major tournament, allowing for a proper send-off rather than an abrupt ending forced by a single loss. His longtime teammate Angel Di Maria weighed in publicly as well, saying flatly that Messi should keep playing for as long as he wants to, and that age alone shouldn't be what decides his future. Head coach Lionel Scaloni has said much the same thing for years now, that Messi will always have a place on the team for as long as he chooses to keep it. There's precedent here worth remembering. Messi actually did announce his retirement from the national team once before, back in 2016, after Argentina lost the Copa America final to Chile on penalties. He reversed that decision 2 months later, saying his love for playing with Argentina was too strong to walk away from. Given that history, nobody close to the team is treating his silence after this final as a confirmed goodbye. There's also a practical piece to consider. Messi's contract with Inter Miami runs through the 2028 MLS season, which means his club career already has real time left on the clock regardless of what he decides internationally. That timeline lines up conveniently with talk out of Argentina that the federation would like him to stick around through the 2028 Copa America, giving him one more major tournament and, more importantly, giving the country a chance to plan a proper send-off rather than have his international career end on a loss nobody got to prepare for. Scaloni has said for years that the door stays open for as long as Messi wants it to, and that framing hasn't changed since the final. It's a strange position for arguably the greatest player of his generation to be in, not officially retired, not officially continuing, with millions of people parsing his body language and a handful of unconfirmed reports for clues about a decision only he can make. He's given no fixed timeline and no dramatic statement either way. For now, the closest thing to an answer is what people around the camp have pieced together secondhand, and what Messi showed with his actions in those final minutes on the pitch, rather than anything he's said outright. What we do know is how he carried himself in the moments right after the loss. By most accounts, he didn't lash out, didn't storm off, didn't direct frustration at his teammates or the officials. His reaction was calm, almost reflective, more focused on the players around him than on the scoreline. Several reports noted that his composure held for most of the immediate aftermath, only for the emotion to catch up with him more visibly later, during the medal ceremony, when the weight of it all, the loss, the age, the possibility that this really was the end, seemed to hit at once. That kind of reaction, quiet instead of furious, tends to be what people point to when they suspect someone is closer to an ending than they're ready to say out loud. Whether that's actually true here is something only Messi himself can answer, and so far, he hasn't. So here's where it all lands. In the same 60 seconds after that final whistle, a World Cup final produced two entirely different stories. One was ugly enough that FIFA opened a formal investigation into it. The other was gentle enough that a teenager who had just won the biggest prize in the sport said it meant as much to him as the medal itself. Messi didn't get the ending he was chasing. He didn't get the back-to-back title, and he didn't get to walk off that pitch as a champion one more time. But in what may turn out to be his final night on football's biggest stage, the moment people are still talking about wasn't about him at all. It was a few sentences, handed to a teenager he once held as a baby, telling him to keep going and that the sport now belongs to players like him. Whether or not this really was Messi's last World Cup, that's the image that's outlasting the scoreline, not the trophy Argentina didn't get to lift, but the choice he made with what was left of that night, to spend it lifting someone else up instead. There's something almost poetic about how the two halves of this story fold into each other. A quiet dressing room speech before kickoff, asking his teammates to forget everything and just play. A furious, chaotic scramble after the whistle that had nothing to do with the football at all. And in between those two extremes, one unscripted minute where a 19-year-old walked away from his own celebration to find the man who unknowingly helped shape his career before he could even walk, and the man told him, in so many words, that it was his turn now. Football doesn't usually hand you a scene like that. Most finals end with one team celebrating and the other disappearing down the tunnel, and whatever gets said between opponents stays private, lost to the noise of the stadium. This one didn't stay private, not because anyone planned it that way, but because a photographer happened to catch the hug, and because Yamal, days later, chose to actually explain what happened instead of letting the moment turn into pure speculation. It's also worth remembering that none of this erases what went wrong elsewhere on that same pitch. FIFA's investigation into the post-match brawl is still ongoing, and Paired still hasn't offered any public apology for his part in it. Gavi's willingness to let it go doesn't necessarily mean the sport's governing body will treat it the same way, and there's a reasonable chance discipline follows once the review is complete. The messier parts of that final whistle are just as real as the tender one, and it would be dishonest to pretend the whole night was wrapped in a bow. But that's also exactly why the Messi-Yamal moment stands out the way it does. It wasn't staged, it wasn't required, and it happened in the same 60 seconds as a brawl that needed coaches and teammates to physically pull grown men apart. Yamal didn't have to walk over. He'd just won the biggest prize in the sport.